All right, everyone, getting started. Today I'm just going to lecture using the screen so it'll upload a bit faster. I won't be able to see my beautiful hair and smile, but you can imagine. Okay, so we're going over Chapter 2 today, particularly looking at how social psychologists gather the knowledge that they use. Some of you who have taken research methods courses will probably know some of this stuff. Nevertheless, it's always good to review it because we'll be talking about several different studies, experiments, different ways in which we try to understand human behavior, social behavior in particular. Okay, well, we start out with a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a prediction of basically what would happen under certain circumstances. For example, you could hypothesize that people who have lower incomes attend poor schools, and that results in less job outcomes. And then that would be a hypothesis, and then you would go about studying people in high school and sort of measuring their performance over time. And once you've sort of developed that, you've tested a few hypotheses, then you can go on to develop a theory where you sort of kind of group this all together to describe some aspect of the real world, so to speak. Now, one thing that we all do, and we're all sort of guilty of this, is something called hindsight bias, where sort of afterward we're like, oh yeah, if I would have known this or that, I would have been able to predict this outcome. And you could think about it in terms of like world events, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, or the election of Trump, or the financial crises, and so on. Like, oh, if I just had known about this coronavirus, then I would have been more prepared. Even if you had known about it, the probabilities of our awareness and action don't always mesh well together, and that's sort of a conditional probability problem there. One major way in which social psychologists and sociologists gather their data is something called observational research. And just like it shows in that picture, you're just essentially observing people's behavior in social situations. So social psychologists will often do something kind of like this, where you'll be in some testing center, and there might be a window, glass mirror sort of thing where people will be recorded. And as you see in this picture, they've got like a video recorder as well as the researcher himself there. Sociologists, when they do observational research, it's a bit different. They won't do it in this sort of lab setting necessarily. They'll often be observing sort of natural social situations. So what goes on at a bus stop, how people act at a sports game, back when we were able to attend those sorts of things. Maybe how people act in a waiting room at a hospital, that sort of thing. So observational research is, like it sounds, you're observing people in their natural habitat or something close to it. There's also something called archival research. A lot of historians and sociologists will use this type of research where you're essentially looking at instances of behavior as recorded in sort of documents that are in some sort of archive. Sometimes you have to go physically to an archive, find the specific shelf that it's on and the place and so on. Increasingly, archival research also means data and big data, and it's sort of a kind of an interesting difference there. You've got like the very analog type of archival research, then you've got the digital type of archival research. We'll be talking about surveys, in particular, the pros and cons. So surveys, you probably filled one out or two, probably regarding, Penn State and classes and that sort of thing. So surveys have some pros and cons. The pros are that you have control over it. You get to write the questions. You administer it. You end up interpreting it if it's your survey, and so on. Now, there are some problems with surveys. They might be limited if you don't get a good sample. To get a good sample, I'll talk about that in a moment. But the survey has to be done randomly, or at least everyone has an equal chance of being chosen, or else it may not be very representative of the population that you're surveying. Also, people may not respond to them. That's a big problem with survey research right now, is that there are really low response rates, partly because there are just so many surveys that are being sent out to people. People have gotten sort of survey fatigue, so to speak. So there are two essential ways you can choose or figure out how to survey, what group you're going to survey. One is called random sampling. Every person has an equal chance of being studied. And the other is convenience sampling, which is more convenient, as you would guess. Basically contacting people as they enter a library, or emailing a fraternity or sorority members that maybe you're friends with, or you're part of that frat or sorority or whatever it might be. So scientifically, we want to get a random sample. The problem with convenience sampling is that maybe, say you're doing a survey on Penn State and coronavirus responses. You may get a different result if you just sample the fraternity or sorority that you're a part of versus a random sample, trying to get everybody on campus, wherever they're living and so on. So what we find then is that for the most part, this kind of intro-level statistics, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but most of the data is found right here in the middle in this kind of bell curve. 68% of the data, and then these are the standard deviations, which are basically, and just to give a very sort of brief explanation, how much a score is deviating from the norm. So let's say this is studying, and everyone is a great student, studying as much as possible. However, you go into the extremes and you find a few people who study far fewer hours, maybe no hours, and a few people who study like 24 hours, never even sleep, they just study. Whereas the vast majority of people, study a number of hours, but nothing extreme, but also nothing extremely high, but also no, fewer hours than necessary. Just some basic statistics that are discussed in your book, and I may return to these, and I'll reintroduce you to them too. Something that's important is called a correlation coefficient. So if we look at two variables, say the effect of income on educational performance, basically we're starting to, if we have a positive association, it goes up to a perfect positive association would be one where you have, perfectly high scores, all A's and high income, basically. There can be a negative association, though, where, fewer hours of education actually lead to then a lower income, that sort of thing. So correlation coefficient is basically a measure of that degree of association between those two variables. Multiple, and again, let's say that was income on educational outcomes. Multiple regression then looks at a number of other variables. So it could say geography, where does a person live, race, maybe gender, and sort of occupation or health, healthcare, that sort of thing. You could add those other variables, which is usually what scientists do, and then determine, which ones seem to have a bigger effect. Maybe it's not income, maybe health is the bigger thing, maybe geography is, and so on. Again, the problem with some of these is, especially with surveys, you're relying upon the survey takers themselves. So what we call statistical significance then is the likelihood that you could have had this result occur by chance. Well, it just sort of happens to be that, a high income leads to a higher educational outcome. We know from other research and so on that that's not necessarily the case. So what we do put this conventional value of 0.5, meaning that basically you have a chance of this happening about 1 in 20 times, meaning it's that's a pretty strong conclusion. In actual research, sometimes we'll go to 0.01, that sort of thing, but that's beyond where we need to go for this class. Correlational research is something that's pretty key, especially in the social sciences, where sometimes it can be hard to determine, just exactly how one variable impacted another variable. So you look at correlation between the two, and then sometimes you can get into greater detail. And this is described in greater detail in your textbook. So correlation, we see this done in social psychology in a lot of experiments. One of the early experiments was Pavlov's dog, which you may be familiar with those. Dogs salivate when they see food or smell it. It doesn't have any effect when there's a bell by itself. However, if each time the bell is rung, then you give it some food, you can get the dog to salivate. If you do that enough, it becomes sort of habituated to the point where the dog salivates just from hearing the bell, even when there's no food there. Okay. So again, as I said, with correlational research, you look at the degree of relationship between two or more different variables. Going from zero up to 1. The closer you get up to 1, a correlation like this, what we call a perfect correlation then. You're getting closer with the D, you start to see that they're forming a line there. C, not so much, and then these are headed in a line in the other direction. So other types of research, again, experimental research. The great things about this is you can control for causation. You can assign participants to different conditions. You could, if you're doing, as we'll talk about, you could have students do an experiment, or let me back that up. You can do an experiment where you're looking at how mention of elderly affects the students. In the experiment, I think I may have mentioned this last time, where just talking about elderly, saying the word elderly, or talking about words associated with being older and so on, actually makes students from one condition, the condition that were exposed to that, they leave the experiment and walk more slowly than the other group who wasn't primed by words like elderly and older people and stuff like that. They actually end up walking faster. So those are two different conditions you end up putting people in. We'll look at more of those as just sort of a basic understanding of experimental research. Again, you've got two variables, at least two that you're looking at. The key thing is the independent variable. This is the thing that is manipulated, and you hypothesize the effect. So the dependent variable then is, you're essentially trying to understand how the independent variable affects the dependent variable. So how many years of schooling, education, that sort of thing. Income versus trying to understand years of income, I guess. Whatever, we'll leave it at that. I think you hopefully get what I'm talking about there. Again, I mentioned this earlier, but I just want to kind of drive this home a little bit because it's such an important part of research. Random assignment is key. What you want to get, say you've got, say blue is men and orange is women. So if you were to just sort of divide this up and look at both, or just look at this, you might not be able to tell as much what the outcome might be, because you've got men and women, and so you're talking about pregnancy in particular, where you might see different responses based on gender. So what you would want to do then is sort of break it up so that perhaps there's more of one group in the control and one group in the treatment. So the control is usually, they're not the ones being manipulated. So here maybe you're talking about pregnancy, whatever your experiment is on, and you see what the impact is there. Because what we're doing here, to sort of give you kind of an overview of this, you've got the population, the group you want to study, say it's U.S. college students. And what you want to do then is find a sample. So as you have here, you've got the whole population, then you want to randomly select people from the population, meaning that everyone in the population is basically as likely to be surveyed as anyone else. Maybe you make contacts, you send out advertisements to every college in America, versus a convenience sample where maybe you just do Penn State, or maybe just your sorority or fraternity at Penn State. They may not be as representative if you were to randomly contact, everyone, students across the country. So what you end up getting then is you get the sample, which is a small look at the greater population. And that often means, what's kind of interesting is that the mean number, the average score, usually is pretty close to the average score in the whole population. It doesn't always match perfectly, but if you were to do that bell curve for the sample and the population, they actually do kind of line up fairly close to each other. And you're not going to need to know a whole lot of statistics beyond that, beyond those few slides there. But do make sure you read those sections of the textbook, because they go into a little bit more detail. So the control condition there is basically the condition that you're basically trying to see how it affects. So here you've got, biofertilizer X's, effect on plant growth. The experimental group uses the biofertilizer, because it's healthy, it's organic, and so on and so forth. Here you don't use that. You use some other type, and then you try to see what the end result is. Sometimes sometimes it doesn't work. Maybe the biofertilizer has something in it that ends up killing the plant, or you see that it actually grows much better than the control group, which does not have it with a dependent variable. A natural experiment, this is something more that sociologists do, where they will look at certain conditions. So, for example, my own research and the research of many of my colleagues from at least a little while ago looked at nation state failures. So one way you would do a natural experiment like that, you can't really start a revolution and bring down the state and then study it from there, is you look at what has happened when governments have failed in the past, and then you kind of develop a sort of comparative historical sort of approach. It's kind of called a natural experiment, because you approach it like an experiment in terms of, okay, were there certain social conditions such as poverty, a distrust in government, the ability to organize together, all these sort of different things, and you can see if you can find some of those variables in several different cases of state failure, revolution, that sort of thing. So the actual experiments are great because you can basically have complete control over the situation and how, what stimuli people are introduced to, what they see, that sort of thing. However, it can lead to some problems with the validity in research. So the validity meaning that, well, you found this interesting thing in an experiment, but is that just something that's the result of, that experimental condition? And can you find the same sort of behavior and responses in the outside, quote unquote, real world? So this is, these are two sort of key points in research. One is reliability. First of all, the results themselves within the study are consistent. So you're studying social anxiety, and one group is getting a sugar pill and the other group is getting some new anti-anxiety med. Within that study, do the people who don't get the med and who do they respond in inconsistent ways? Is everybody acting the same way? Then if they are, then you have greater reliability. Then comes validity. Now, does this mean maybe there's something in that condition, something about the lighting in the room or whatever, that causes people with that, the anti-anxiety medication to act a certain way? And then if you take them out into the real world and it's all hectic and there's not that nice light or a nice room you were in the psych department or whatever, maybe it just doesn't work the same way out in the real world. So these are two of the key things that all social scientists are really trying to make sure that they have in their studies. Measurement validity, here is just kind of the text version of what I said. Measurement of it's a correlation between some measure and some outcome. So our IQ test, the true measures of what people think of as intelligence. Other things we see is studies that suggest personality tests actually rarely predict behavior in specific situations, which is really fascinating, and often shows how important the social situation is. Remember, don't commit the fundamental attribution error. Okay, and we'll talk about actually IQ in some detail later on, so I'll just wait to return to that. Regression to the mean, I kind of talked about that a little bit earlier. Again, we tend to see in almost all sort of behavior and stuff like that, where you've got most of the people average scores. Let's say if this is the IQ test, most people are in the average. You got some people who score like 70 or below, who often will need help for the rest of their lives because they just don't have the cognitive ability to do some of the things that are required in modern contemporary society. Then you've got the high scorers on IQ tests, who oftentimes will be, brilliant geniuses, go on to be very successful in life, or perhaps sometimes the opposite, where they've got really high IQs, but they didn't get the socialization that would have helped them use their higher IQs, and maybe weren't able to socialize, that sort of thing. So it works sort of both ways, having a high IQ. Statistical significance, I kind of talked about that a little bit. The main thing here being that this is a measure of the probability that this result would have happened by chance. So, it's a very low probability that those with the finding that those who have a higher level of education will have a higher income throughout life. We find that so often that, the chance that it is just, that we find that it just is the result of a chance, and there's nothing really going on there. We call that having a low statistical significance. Two different types of research. One is what we call basic science. So basic science is, like genetic testing or, kind of mapping neurobiology. Or if you're, trying to just examine how governments fail, how societies collapse, that sort of thing. You basically what you're doing then is basically, pun intended, I guess, you're doing basic research, trying to understand some underlying phenomenon, not necessarily trying to change the world or, trying to say, hey, trying to write a how-to guide and say, hey, here's what you need to do to fix this or how to address this issue. You're just trying to find out the knowledge, the science itself. The other sort of counterpart to that is what's called applied research. So here you might be usually start out reviewing basic science and some of the research there, and then sort of trying to find out, okay, based on that knowledge, how can we apply it to the real world? And then so you might get sort of applications, sort of experiments that are done to see how people act in certain situations. Then you may try to influence that behavior later. So if you find, for example, which I think I mentioned in one of the previous lectures, or was that 2 years ago? Well, we'll see. Okay, so basically we see that, researchers have found that being exposed to natural light makes people feel better. They actually work more productively in experimental conditions and so on. And so a few companies then have sort of said, okay, well, let's look at this research and see if we can apply some of this in what they're called our industrial psychologists or industrial sociologists, organizational sociologists sometimes. And what they'll do then is say, okay, we find that people work better, at least in experimental conditions, with some natural light. How about we try that in the work world, some office building, some factory floor, that sort of thing. Put in some more windows, see how that works. In research, then that sort of applied research tends to find that natural light makes people work more efficiently, more productively, and makes them happier. So the production level is actually quite significant. I mean, it's like improves or increases productivity between like 30 and 40%. I mean, that's a huge increase just by having some natural light. Now, another key part of the scientific study is what's called replication. Now, replication is basically, so you do this fascinating finding, you do this fascinating research with this interesting finding that workers work more in places where they have more natural light. Now, say this study hadn't been replicated. No one's ever, tried to try it again. In the real world, that study has been replicated many times and so on and so forth. People have done that basic research before. But let's say people didn't. They just did this one basic science study. And they find that people work better with natural light in the psychology office. And so then they publish their results, and all of a sudden everyone's like, whoa, this is a fascinating finding. Why don't we, knock out our walls and put in windows? And because no one ever replicated this study, it turns out that the people, the sample they used, the students who they were paying to come in and do this task with the natural light on in the psych office. It turns out this was just a highly motivated group of students who worked much more than your average student. And because of that, it turns out that the window made no difference. And all these companies then, they spend, thousands of dollars putting in these new windows, only to find it doesn't actually work in the real world. Then somebody decides to replicate that finding, and they try it again, and they use a random sample of people, and they find that, okay, the windows help, but maybe they don't help 100%. They don't lead to double the amount of productivity, that sort of thing. In the real world, though, people have tried that study again and again using different samples, different sample sizes, different windows, and they were able to kind of come up with a realistic number of about 30 to 40% in terms of worker productivity that gets increased. Now, this is an important concept for sociology and psychology, economics, and especially for the medical sciences. So here's where there's a bit of a problem, in the sense that basically you have, you'll see this in newspapers every so often. There'll be some headline of a study. Well, actually, let me bring this to coronavirus and the vaccine. So, say there is some group that's doing research on a coronavirus vaccine, and they get some positive result. And they say, hey, we've got this vaccine for coronavirus. And everyone's like, oh, fantastic. And start mass producing them. And, everybody's getting this shot, or at least the 2/3 of Americans who plan to, 1/3 doesn't. So you have 2/3 of Americans, getting this shot. And then it turns out that, it doesn't actually work. And most of these people don't get better. And it turns out that the person who did get better just got better on their own. And it had nothing to do with this because nobody replicated this study. Then a few people end up trying that study again. It turns out you try other randomly selected patients, and it just doesn't work out. So that's what's going to happen with the vaccine research. You're going to have, one of the reasons is takes a while is you can't just do a study where you find a positive result and say, hey, all right, let's have millions of people, tens of millions, billions of people take this, take this drug. You need to basically replicate it a few times and bring in another group of people from all over the world, that sort of thing. And then you can become more confident in the study that you've made. Okay, just a final thing. So replication, those of you who are intending to go into the medical sciences and the social sciences as well, and the other natural sciences, just remember that right now there's a big crisis in medical and psychological science because there's not enough replication that's going on. For people that go on to graduate school, one of the main things that you're told is to do some groundbreaking research that some topic that no one else is doing, which is great. Except we need people to replicate some studies. Try to redo a study to see if it holds up in your part of the world, or with your sample, that sort of thing. So it's a really, really key concept that researchers need to do. There are also a lot of ethical concerns in social psych, and so what I'll basically ask you to do then for the next 10 minutes or so, is to look in the modules for Chapter 2, because I'll have a brief clip of the Stanley Milgram experiment, because that led to this huge change in the ethics of research. And now people have to go through what's called an IRB, an Institutional Review Board, which is this organization that every research university has, where they examine the proposals to make sure that you're not going to cause any harm, that if you are being deceptive, which is often the case in psychological research, that it's not to the point where it's going to leave long-lasting harm on the individual, more that they might kind of laugh about and be like, oh, you had me kind of fooled there. I thought it was shocking, this person who were getting these words wrong from the Milgram experiment. So I'll post a little video about that, and maybe a little video on the Stanford prison experiments, which again both happened at nearly the same time, about a decade apart or so, but both led to this change in terms of the ethics that we use. So one of the things we need is informed consent, where basically anyone who's going to take part in a study has to be aware of it. They have to say, yes, I want to be part of this study. That's what informed consent is. If they are being deceived, you have to let them know, and it can't be a sort of deception that's going to cause them undue distress. And where that line is something that's determined by the research itself and by the Institutional Review Board. Okay, so I will post a couple of 10 minutes, about a 10-minute video or so to Canvas, and then you can watch this lecture, you can view that. Some of you are maybe familiar with these experiments, and then you can post into Packback for the rest of the class period. All right, have a good day. And Chapter 3 is going to get really fascinating, because we'll be talking about differences between East Asians and Western folk in terms of psychological attitudes. We'll also talk about psychological differences between liberals and conservatives and stuff like that. So it should be an interesting, fascinating class next time. All right, I will be available today during chat and monitoring Packback discussions. Have a good rest of your day and a